Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. A recent book on 26/11 called The Siege has raised worrying questions about India's preparedness and its response. It suggests that multiple alerts were received but either not acted upon or even worse, ignored. It reveals extensive ISI involvement and even a network of Pakistani spies, and it documents the lackadaisical response of the Mumbai police as well as the National Security Guard. With me to discuss many of the issues raised by the book is one of its critical authors, Adrian Levy. Adrian, your book says that between August 2006 and 26/11/2008, India received some 26 alerts, some of which you say were delivered by the CIA directly to RAW. And you add that 3 of these specifically mentioned the use of the Fidayeen, 6 pointed to a seaport infiltration, 11 suggested that there would be multiple simultaneous attacks. Let me ask you this. How do you know this?
Well, what we attempted to do was which is to travel across borders to reach out to as many countries as possible without being weighed down by diplomatic protocol, and gather together a cast list of all the people who were prime principal actors in the events and get them to tell their story on and off the record. You know, we're talking about several hundred interviews.
So all those interviews together delivered the information that 26 alerts had been given to India roughly over a 2-year period.
Yes, multiply sourced, and I can tell you something even more shocking, known within IB and discussed within IB and told to us by officers recently retired from within the intelligence establishment.
So this information about 26 alerts and the nature of those alerts actually came, in some instances, from IB officers?
Yes, correct. Yes, absolutely correct.
So you're absolutely confident that they are correct and accurate?
I'm absolutely confident because of the range and multiplicity of the sources available, and the fact that in some instances, not in India, I hasten to add, we could read the bulletins. So I actually know the content of some of the bulletins.
You actually physically read the bulletin of some of these alerts?
Physically read them. So I can tell you, for example, the number of targets that were named, all of which were correctly identified, apart from Nariman House, the Jewish centre.
And many of those targets were actually hit?
All the ones named were hit, yeah, absolutely. The only thing that wasn't known was the parameter of dates that was on offer.
So is one of your conclusions that if these 26 alerts had been acted upon, either 26/11 could have been averted, or at least the damage done could have been limited?
I think the latter. I think we have to see this within the broader world of how the intelligence community works. Remember, we dropped the ball in 7/7 in London. We dropped the ball in 9/11. Huge amounts was known about the protagonists in both of those terrorist outrages, and we still couldn't prevent them. So to say that RAW IB could have prevented, I think, is another world away. But what one could say is the city could have been geared up for war, and instead the city was an open, joyride for anyone who came.
Let's focus a little on the Taj Hotel, which in a very real sense is at the very center of your book, The Siege. Now, your book makes clear that the Taj did implement a whole series of security measures, but they were being steadily wound down. And the interesting thing is, just 2 weeks before 26/11, the armed police picket outside the lobby of the tower block was actually dismissed. How critical a mistake, how critical a lapse was that?
Well, one has to say that it was disastrous. I think it was a catastrophe. But you see, there's a conflict between what the security chiefs want and what the House of Magic, which is what the Taj regards itself as, what the House of Magic wants to conjure with its guests. And hospitality and security do not sit easily together, although in Israel that seems to work quite well.
In fact, in your book, you quote one of the explanations given to you by the hotel for winding down the security measures that they had taken. You say it could not be expected to sustain on a war footing, given that 26/11 was just days away from the December peak tourist season, given that the Taj is a major tourist hotel. Was that winding down understandable, or was it even then still a critical bad lapse?
I think it was critical. I think it's impossible really to comprehend what they were doing. You've got a senior Mumbai police officer walking in and telling them they're ill-prepared and they're going to get hit.
And they ignored it?
Well, after a lot of cajoling, bullying, badgering and repeated meetings, they came up with a raft of security measures. The policeman goes on holiday and they dismantle them.
So there is a real sense in which what you're suggesting is that they were negligent, at least not fully responsible
Yes, yeah, completely. I think not fully responsible. I think that hotels all over the world potentially now are on, are living on their nerves, wondering, whether they too will be hit. But in this case, a comprehensive warning was delivered. A 9-hour survey of the hotel and its perimeter was given by the police. There were intelligence feeds and inputs, but somehow the hotel did not feel that that sat easily with the mirage of a luxury establishment.
Let's move away from the question of preparedness or lack of preparedness and come to the actual attack when it happened on 26/11. Now, you've done extensive research. Do you believe that this attack was the work of Lashkar? Was it the work of ISI, or was it the work of both?
Yes, I mean, I think this was the most critical area of the research that we did. Evidently, it's a Lashkar-e-Toiba attack. Evidently, it's a Fedayeen squad. We got to two of the training centres. We got to some of the squad of 32 boys who were initially recruited. That was cut down to 10. But ISI is like a ball of wool. And to actually disentangle all those strands is difficult. I would say the institution didn't know, but the individual officers were key to the organisation of the raid.
This is very important. The ISI as an institution didn't know, but individual ISI officers were key. Are you suggesting that they were operating as some sort of rogues, or were they doing it deliberately at a distance from the institution so that the institution could be protected and not accused?
Well, I think to say that would assume that the ISI is cohesive, and actually the ISI is not cohesive. There's no central command, and the people responsible for jihad and waging war against India in the loosest way are often 30-years. They've been in for 3 decades, and they're no longer controlled by anyone.
So these are not rogues, but these are independent, autonomous entities within the ISI, and the ISI's loose, amorphous nature allows them to carry on without appearing to be rogues.
Encourages them to carry on. I think that's very much the very nature of working in the jihad factory.
Now, your book makes clear that David Headley's ISI handler was a man called Major Iqbal. It was Iqbal who sent him in for counterintelligence training, surveillance training. It was Iqbal who gave him £15,000 in counterfeit Indian currency. How closely did the ISI control Headley, and how closely did they control Lashkar?
ISI absolutely controlled Lashkar. Lashkar is a tool of individual officers and of the establishment in terms of how it increases tension, moving over the line of control in Kashmir, making India bleed. It definitely is part of Pakistan.
ISI controls Lashkar completely?
Well, ISI controls Lashkar, but prior to this raid, Lashkar had split terribly. And a large section of Lashkar was fleeing to move towards the more adventurous, glamorous Al-Qaeda wing, and the other half was hanging behind as the old guard who would simply attack India. And so you have an organisation ribbon down the middle. ISI is fighting to consolidate elements of ISI.
Which makes it a much more dangerous organisation because control is now weakening and yet direction is still there.
Exactly right, yeah.
Now, your book makes crystal clear that there were many occasions when the Americans had good reason to be suspicious of Headley. They even received several warnings from his 2 wives, and yet they ignored them. Is there a sense in which the American authorities were negligent, perhaps even irresponsible in their attitude to Headley?
I mean, the evidence seems the evidence that is presented seems to suggest that America has pursued a very narrow self-interest here. A very narrow self-interest. It's not simply that numerous people, including his mother, family members, friends, neighbours in Pakistan, in America, in India, complained in detail. It's that the organisations that received those complaints simply refused to act on them. It's not that they were negligent.
These are American
organisations within Joint Task Force Terrorism, FBI, CIA, security advisors.
Why did they refuse to act? Because they didn't believe the information they were getting, or because he was too valuable and they didn't want to compromise his value to them?
I would suggest that in fact it was the latter, and that Headley, if you think about it as a hybrid, a man who is both American and Pakistani, carrying an American passport, can look American, can look Caucasian, and can also blend in a Pakistani environment.
So he was invaluable and they didn't want to lose him?
They didn't want to lose him.
In fact, in an interview that you gave Outlook magazine, you said, a terrible call was made, a narrow self-interested one, to allow Headley to run on. And then you added, Mumbai was, in one sense, sacrificed along the way.
Yes.
You really mean that Mumbai was sacrificed by selfish Americans who could have acted to prevent Headley, although they didn't know Mumbai would be the sacrifice, but if they'd acted, Mumbai wouldn't have been the sacrifice.
In one sense, I think that's absolutely true, in the sense that he was moving closer to Al-Qaeda. The prime objective of CIA at that time was to behead Al-Qaeda by capturing bin Laden. And remember, this is three years or so before Abbottabad, which means that in that case, the desire to capture bin Laden was absolutely, there within the intelligence community.
So all of that became paramount, and therefore concerns about what Headley could do to other people, other cities, other countries diminished.
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely get that impression. At the same time, remember that an agent who is embedded, an agent of influence, a source who is embedded, is hard to control. And Headley mostly served himself, and what his personal story tells us, having got to his family and friends throughout the years in America and Pakistan, is that Headley's #1 client was Headley.
In fact, your book has an enormous amount of detail about Headley's life in Pakistan, the manner in which he was controlled by the ISI, the way he was trained, the monies that were given to him, his 2 wives and how he lived with them, literally moving one night at one home, another night at another home. How difficult was it to put together this amount of extensive detail in today's Pakistan?
Yeah, it is amazingly difficult. I mean, it requires a lot of patience and a number of years to repeatedly approach people and coax them out into telling a story. But this really comes at the back end of 18 years spent coming and going, toing and froing, and building the confidence of people.
So you know Pakistan very well?
Know Pakistan very well, and also attempt to try and get some balance in there by enabling people to talk safely and securely and passing information. But it was an enormous jigsaw puzzle.
Now, one of the things that emerges from your book, and is pretty revelatory for an Indian audience, is that Major Iqbal told Headley that the ISI had, and I'm quoting from your book, a super agent at work in Delhi who was known as Honeybee. And this Honeybee was the person that gave the ISI Indian manuals for training. And he's also the person who indicated that Badwar Park in Mumbai would be an ideal landing point. Do you have any idea, any hint who Honeybee might be?
No, we tried very hard to get at the identity. Initially, we thought it may be, in the broader sense, a kind of counter-espionage by ISI to suggest that, in fact, India was in more ways culpable. I mean, the one thing to remember here is that Pakistan attacked India. India did not attack itself. But we tested that idea of Honeybee, and evidence gathered covertly by investigators in Pakistan in the barrack-like buildings where the Fedayeen stayed in Karachi, and in the control room before it was swept clean by the ISI, shows that there was documentation present that originated from India, and that documentation was counter-hostage strategy, methodology.
You've seen some of this documentation
I have
yourself.
had it talked through in great detail by people who saw it themselves, what it consisted of.
Does that suggest, when you use not just the language, a super agent at work in Delhi, but also you're aware of the nature of the documentation he made available to the ISI, does that together suggest that Honeybee was someone in Indian intelligence?
I had no real feeling for that, other than that the documentation provided must have come from within the broader national security community. But at the same time, I was doing research on the US Marines, and I happened to do quite a lot of digging and found their room clearance operations available through an academic website. So,
this documentation that you're aware of that Honeybee is supposed to have handed over to the ISI, can you have any sense of how important it was? How privileged it was?
I think actually it was significant. I think it was significant for 2 reasons. One, when the NSG finally got to do what they do very well inside the Taj, what they discovered was the tactics being used against them were their own.
NSG's own tactics were being used against them by, in fact, the terrorists who'd come in.
Yes.
And so those terrorists had access to NSG's training manuals.
Certainly access to the methodology used, non-verbal communication, room clearance, the methodology of entry and exit points in a room where there may be gunmen inside, protection of the door, guarding the corridor, exactly the strategy that the NSG would deploy in a top-down clearance in the tower and the palace of the Taj.
2 quick questions before I take a break. Does that suggest that Honeybee was someone very senior?
It suggests that Honeybee had access to training material And therefore, that's where we should begin looking first.
Number two, do you have any reason to believe that Honeybee is not a one-off, that there may be many more like Honeybee infiltrating Indian intelligence and perhaps the wider Indian system?
You know, in the broader sense, over 18 years of looking into these issues, what I've discovered is that Pakistan lives in India and India lives in Pakistan.
So there are spies on both sides.
And we are, you know, we can see this across fertilization between both.
Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to turn to the second critical part of this interview. How good or how bad was India's response to 26/11? That's in a moment's time. Stick with us. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an interview with Adrian Levy, the author of a recent book on 26/11, which raises serious questions, damaging and worrying questions about India's preparedness and its response. Let's turn to India's response. You say in your book that Mumbai Police Commissioner Abdul Ghafoor didn't act always according to standard operating practices because he had personal problems with some police officers and he didn't want them to occupy critical positions after 26/11 happened. And secondly, you point out that rather than order a coordinated, full-fledged police response, he deliberately waited for the NSG. Now, together, to Indians, that seems damning. Are you absolutely sure of it?
Yes, absolutely sure. Reconstructed from the mouths of nearly all the senior police officers at the scene, nearly every single one of them who we interviewed either on the record or off the record. And what you have there is a picture really of a complete and utter dereliction.
One of the police officers quoted extensively in your book is in fact Joint Commissioner Raj Vardhan. You quote his thoughts in the book, or you paraphrase them, where he clearly is expressing a sense of incredulity at the response or lack of response of his own police force. So policemen at the time were in their own hearts and minds questioning what Abdul Ghafoor was up to.
Feeling desperate, whether it was in the police control room in Mumbai or the two senior officers inside the Taj.
So did Abdul Ghafoor's action, or rather lack of action, convert an already bad situation into one that became considerably worse?
A combination of police inaction, the inability to mobilise the Black Cats, led to the Fidayeen becoming comfortable in an environment from which they could have been winkled out much quicker.
So in a nutshell, former Police Commissioner Abdul Ghafoor has a lot to answer for in your eyes.
Ghafoor and the people responsible for failing to mobilise and transport the NSG.
Let's come to the NSG, because that's the second critical aspect of the response your book goes into considerable detail about. You confirm that there were not only delays in summoning the NSG, but after it was summoned, a plane couldn't be found. After the plane was found, there was no fuel. After they got to Mumbai, there was no transport for the NSG commanders to be taken from the airport to the city centre. I mean, it is a litany not just of errors, it's almost a comedy of errors. Do you get the feeling that India's so-called preparedness to handle an emergency was actually completely lacking?
Completely compromised, and not by the NSG itself. The NSG was ready. The NSG was there on the tarmac in the area to mobilise, and yet they were confronted with a series of catastrophic mistakes made by the people who are meant to shield them and dispatch them.
So much of what you have to say about the NSG seems to have come from Brigadier Sisodia, who at the time was the deputy head of the NSG and now is head of security at Tata Hotels. So am I right in surmising that actually what you said of the NSG has been told to you by the horse's mouth itself?
Yes, everything on the NSG comes from within a range of half a dozen people at the most senior level.
Pause at this moment and give me your assessment of India's preparedness as well as its response to 26/11.
I think that the response was catastrophic in many ways, and I think the preparedness showed a complete lack of care in many, many ways. Not to say that they could have thwarted it. You know, Western intelligence agencies have been confounded when they've been called to stand up and be counted, but in this case there appears, particularly afterwards, to be a lack of care.
Caught with their pants down?
Caught with their pants down, and then afterwards the cover-up. Pradhan Commission, 64 pages. Where was the analysis of the disaster?
One other thing very quickly before we get to the end of this interview. Your book also, right at the end, in the afterword, confirms something that's been rumoured for a long time. You confirm that Zakiur Rahman, the operational head of LET, in jail at the moment, undergoing a trial, actually has access A, to a mobile phone, B, full conjugal rights with his wife, and C, at least on one occasion was visited by General Pasha, then head of the ISI. Is all of that actually a fact?
Absolutely the case, yes. And you know, we met with people who'd been part of the regular visiting squad to Zaki, and he is treated as a king in his own environment in the prison. And one wonders what that means for the court case and which way it will go.
Well, exactly my question. Does that mean that the court case in Pakistan is in fact a farce?
I think that the civilian investigators intended to bring all the evidence there was to bear, and yet the establishment, elements of it that are guarding Lashkar, are less keen for that process to continue.
My last question. Your verdict on India's preparedness for 2611 and its response to 2611 was damning. Do you fear that if another 2611 were to be perpetrated again, India would go down the same route and be caught once again, as you said, with their pants down?
Institutionally, yes, but what did 2611 show? It showed that ordinary Indians became heroes, and the heart and the soul of that fight back, which actually led to the saving of lives, that will happen again.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that aspect of our book, but for the sake of the audience, I will point out that in fact a lot of the book is a tribute to people like Chef Uberoy of the Taj, Karambir Kang, the general manager who lost his entire family, and Amit Peshave, and others like them who sacrificed their lives to save guests. That's the other aspect of a book that we can't go into, but it's a very important part. Adrian Levy, a pleasure talking to you.
A great pleasure. Thank you so much.